4th, 1942, 10:22 in the morning. A single 1,000-pound bomb punches through the flight deck of the most feared aircraft carrier in the Pacific Ocean. It tears through steel, like paper, plunges into the hangar deck below, and detonates in the middle of fully fueled aircraft loaded with live torpedoes. The explosion is instantaneous. Aviation gasoline sprays out like a waterfall and ignites. A torpedo rips free from a burning bomber, rolls across the deck, slams into a steel column, and explodes. That explosion triggers the torpedo on the aircraft next to it. Then the next one. Then the next. In under 90 seconds, the entire hangar deck of IJN Akagi transforms into a fireball exceeding 1,000 degrees Celsius. Aluminum melts. Men burst into flames where they stand. They don't even have time to scream. And the man who dropped that bomb, he wasn't a general. He wasn't a famous ace. He was a 30-year-old former factory worker from a small town who had barely survived flight school. His name was Lieutenant Richard Halsey Best, and with one single bomb released from his SBD Dauntless dive bomber, he did something that an entire fleet of torpedo planes, 41 aircraft, and dozens of brave pilots had failed to do just minutes before. He killed the Red Dragon. He broke the spine of Japanese naval power, and he changed the entire course of World War II in the Pacific. This is the story of how it happened. To understand why that single bomb mattered so much, you need to understand what the world looked like in early 1942. And the picture was terrifying. December 7th, 1941. Japanese aircraft launched from 6 carriers, including Akagi, descended on Pearl Harbor like a swarm of steel hornets. In less than 2 hours, they sank or damaged 8 American battleships, destroyed 188 aircraft on the ground, and killed 403 Americans. The United States Pacific Fleet was crippled in a single morning.
And that was just the beginning. Over the next 6 months, the Imperial Japanese Navy went on a rampage across the Pacific and Indian Oceans that stunned the entire world. They captured Wake Island. They seized Guam. They invaded the Philippines and forced the largest American surrender in history when 76,000 troops laid down their arms at Bataan. They stormed through Malaya and captured Singapore, taking 130,000 British and Commonwealth soldiers prisoner in what Winston Churchill called the worst disaster in British military history. They bombed Darwin, Australia. They raided Ceylon in the Indian Ocean, sinking a British carrier and 2 heavy cruisers. Everywhere the Japanese fleet appeared, it won. Everywhere it struck, it left devastation. And at the heart of this unstoppable war machine were 4 aircraft carriers. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu. These were the ships of the Kido Butai, the first air fleet, the most powerful carrier strike force ever assembled. They had participated in every major Japanese victory since Pearl Harbor. Their pilots were the best trained in the world, many with years of combat experience from the war in China. Their Zero fighters were faster and more agile than anything the Americans could put in the air. Their torpedo bombers were deadly accurate. Their dive bombers rarely missed. The Japanese believed these 4 carriers were invincible. And honestly, by June 1942, it was hard to argue with them. The numbers spoke for themselves. 6 months of unbroken victories. Millions of square miles of ocean and territory conquered. Every enemy fleet that had tried to stand against the Kido Butai had been smashed. The British, the Dutch, the Australians, the Americans. All defeated, all humiliated. But there was one man in the American Navy who refused to accept that the situation was hopeless. His name was Admiral Chester Nimitz, and he had a secret weapon that the Japanese didn't know about. Not a new ship, not a new aircraft, not a new bomb. Something far more powerful. Information. American codebreakers working in a cramped basement office at Pearl Harbor, known as Station Hypo, had partially broken the Japanese naval code designated JN-25. The lead codebreaker was Commander Joseph Rochefort, a man who practically lived in his bathrobe, worked 20-hour days, and hadn't seen sunlight in weeks. Rochefort and his team of cryptanalysts, linguists, and mathematicians had been intercepting and decrypting Japanese radio transmissions for months.
And in May 1942, they picked up something that made their blood run cold. The Japanese were planning a massive operation. The target was designated AF in the intercepted messages. Rochefort believed AF was Midway Island, a tiny atoll roughly 300 miles northwest of Hawaii. Midway was critical. If Japan captured it, they would have a forward base within striking distance of Hawaii itself. But more importantly, the Japanese plan wasn't really about capturing Midway. It was a trap. Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor and the commander of the entire Japanese combined fleet, wanted to use Midway as bait. He would attack the island, force the American carriers to come out and fight, and then destroy them with overwhelming force. With the American carriers gone, Japan would control the Pacific completely. Yamamoto's plan was brilliant on paper. He had 11 battleships, 8 carriers, 23 cruisers, 65 destroyers, and over 200 aircraft. The Americans had no battleships available, only 3 carriers, 8 cruisers, and 15 destroyers. The odds were absurdly lopsided. By every conventional calculation, the Japanese should have won easily. But Nimitz knew the plan. He knew where. He knew when. He knew the Japanese order of battle, and he set his own trap. Now here is where the story of Richard Best begins. Best was born in 1910 in Bayonne, New Jersey. His father worked in a factory. There was nothing special about his childhood. Nothing that would have predicted he would one day change the course of history. He joined the Navy in 1928, earned his wings as a naval aviator, and by 1942, he was a lieutenant commanding Bombing Squadron 6, known as VB-6, aboard USS Enterprise. Best was not a celebrated hero. He wasn't one of those pilots whose name appeared in newspapers. He was a quiet, precise, meticulous man who believed that dive bombing was a science, not an art. While other pilots relied on instinct, Best studied angles, wind speeds, release altitudes, and approach vectors with almost obsessive attention to detail. He drilled his squadron relentlessly. He demanded perfection. Some of his men thought he was too intense, too serious, too rigid. But Best had a philosophy that he repeated to his pilots constantly. You get one pass, one dive, one bomb. If you miss, you don't get a second chance. The enemy will shoot you down before you can come around again, so you do not miss. That philosophy was about to be tested in the most dramatic way imaginable. June 4th, 1942, 4:30 in the morning. On the 4 Japanese carriers northwest of Midway, engines roared to life. The first attack wave launched into the pre-dawn sky. 108 aircraft carrying bombs and torpedoes headed for Midway Island. From Akagi alone, 27 planes took off. Admiral Nagumo stood on the bridge confident. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned. Midway would be softened up, the American fleet would come running, and the Kido Butai would destroy it. But Nagumo didn't know that Enterprise Hornet and Yorktown were already positioned northeast of Midway, hiding just over the horizon, waiting. At 7:28 in the morning, a Japanese reconnaissance seaplane sent a message that changed everything. Enemy ships spotted. The words hit Nagumo's bridge like a physical blow. Enemy ships. Here, this wasn't supposed to happen yet. Then, at 8:09, the worst possible update arrived. Enemy force includes what appears to be a carrier. Now Nagumo faced a nightmare scenario. His reserve aircraft on the flight decks were armed with land attack bombs for a second strike on Midway. But if there was an American carrier out there, he needed those planes armed with torpedoes to strike ships. He gave the order that would seal Akagi's fate. Rearm immediately. Switch from bombs to torpedoes. On Akagi's hangar deck, chaos erupted. Hundreds of sailors began the frantic process of removing bombs from aircraft and replacing them with heavy torpedoes. This was not a quick job. Each bomb had to be carefully detached, each torpedo carefully mounted. Bombs that were removed were supposed to be stored safely below in the magazines. But there was no time. Sailors stacked them along the walls of the hangar deck. Fuel lines were being connected to aircraft for the upcoming launch. Aviation gasoline flowed freely. And then it got worse. The first wave aircraft returning from the Midway strike were running low on fuel and needed to land immediately. The flight deck had to be cleared to receive them, which meant the rearming process was interrupted again. Planes being armed were pushed aside. Returning planes landed, were quickly refueled, and pushed to the side. The hangar deck became a nightmare of disorganized aircraft, loose ordnance fuel hoses, and exhausted men working at a desperate pace. By 10:20 in the morning, Akagi was a floating bomb. Dozens of aircraft crammed together. Torpedoes mounted and unmounted lying everywhere. Bombs stacked along the walls. Aviation gasoline flowing through lines and pooled on the deck. All it would take was one spark, one hit, one single bomb in the right place. But first, the Americans tried the hard way. Starting at 7:00 in the morning, wave after wave of American aircraft attacked the Japanese carriers, and wave after wave was slaughtered. Torpedo Squadron 8 from USS Hornet attacked first. 15 TBD Devastator torpedo bombers, slow and obsolete, lumbering toward the Japanese fleet at barely 200 kilometers per hour. They had no fighter escort. 0 fighters from the Kido Butai fell on them like wolves on sheep. The massacre was total. All 15 aircraft were shot down. Not one torpedo was dropped successfully. Only one man survived. Ensign George Gay, who floated in the ocean and watched the entire battle from the water. Then, Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise, 14 more Devastators. Same result. Zeros and anti-aircraft fire tore them apart. Then, Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown, 12 more planes. Same fate. In total, 41 torpedo bombers attacked the Japanese fleet that morning. 35 were shot down. Not a single torpedo hit any Japanese ship. On Akagi's deck, Japanese sailors cheered. They had repelled everything the Americans threw at them. 3 attack waves destroyed completely. It seemed like another easy victory. The celebrations were premature, because those doomed torpedo bombers had done something extraordinary without knowing it. They had pulled every single Zero fighter down to sea level. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol, which was supposed to protect the fleet from attack at all altitudes, was now entirely concentrated at low altitude, chasing the last of the torpedo planes. The sky above the Japanese fleet, at 10,000, 15,000, 20,000 feet, was completely, utterly, totally empty. And at that exact moment, at an altitude of 500 meters, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey and 37 SBD Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise were circling desperately, searching for the Japanese fleet. They were almost out of fuel. McCluskey was minutes away from ordering his squadron to turn back. Then he spotted something. A single Japanese destroyer, Arashi, racing at full speed across the ocean below, leaving a white wake behind her, like an arrow pointing northwest. Arashi was hurrying to rejoin the main fleet, after depth charging an American submarine. McCluskey made the decision that would change history. Follow that destroyer. At 10:20 in the morning, the Japanese carriers appeared below him. 4 flat tops, their flight decks packed with aircraft completely unprotected from above. McCluskey signaled his squadron. Push over. Attack. The squadron split. Most of the bombers targeted Kaga, the largest carrier. But Lieutenant Richard Best, leading a 3-plane section, saw the confusion and made a split-second decision. He pulled his section away and aimed for a different target. Akagi. 3 planes against the most feared carrier in the Pacific. Best pushed his stick forward and began his dive. 70-degree angle. Speed climbing through 380 kilometers per hour. 400. The wind screamed past his canopy. Akagi's flight deck grew larger in his bomb sight. He could see men on the deck, looking up frozen. At 550 meters, he released his 1,000-pound bomb and pulled out of the dive, the G-forces crushing him into his seat. The bomb fell for approximately 6 seconds. On Akagi's deck, those who saw it coming had no time to react, no time to run, no time to do anything except watch death fall from the sky. What happened next would burn for 18 hours and sink an empire. But that story belongs to part 2. In part 1, you saw how a former factory worker's son named Richard Best dove his SBD Dauntless at a 70-degree angle toward the flight deck of Japan's most feared aircraft carrier. You saw how 41 torpedo bombers were massacred, trying to do what Best was about to attempt with just 3 planes. You saw how one bomb, one single 1,000-pound bomb, fell for 6 seconds toward a ship packed with fuel torpedoes and live ordnance. Now let me tell you what happened when that bomb hit. Because what followed was not just an explosion. It was the beginning of 18 hours of pure hell that would kill 267 men and sink an empire. And the most terrifying part, the Japanese had every chance to prevent it. Every single one. They chose wrong at every turn. And here is where the story gets worse. 10:22 and 30 seconds in the morning. Best's 1,000-pound bomb, a 454-kilogram steel monster, packed with high explosives, struck Akagi's flight deck just aft of the center elevator. It did not explode on the surface. That would have been bad enough. Instead, it punched clean through the armored flight deck, like a fist through wet cardboard, plunged into the cavernous hangar deck below, and detonated in the exact center of the ship's most vulnerable space. The timing could not have been more catastrophic if it had been planned by God himself. Remember what was on that hangar deck. Remember the decision Admiral Nagumo had made barely 2 hours earlier. Switch from bombs to torpedoes. That order had turned Akagi's hangar into a floating ammunition dump. Aircraft were lined up wingtip to wingtip, some armed with torpedoes, some half-armed, some still carrying the bombs that had been hastily removed and stacked against the walls because there was no time to store them properly. Fuel lines snaked across the deck, pumping aviation gasoline into aircraft being prepared for launch. The air itself was thick with gasoline fumes. Best's bomb detonated in the middle of all of it. The initial explosion was devastating, but it was what happened in the next 8 seconds that turned a bad situation into an apocalypse. The blast wave ripped through a row of B-5 NK torpedo bombers parked on the hangar deck. One aircraft was thrown sideways. The Type 91 torpedo mounted beneath it, tore free from its mount, flew across the deck, and its detonator struck a steel support column. The torpedo exploded with a force that dwarfed the original bomb. Its 200-kilogram warhead tore apart the fuselage of the adjacent aircraft. That aircraft also carried a torpedo. It detonated. Then the one next to it, then the next. Chain reaction. The two most terrifying words in naval warfare. Within seconds, a second massive explosion ripped through the center of the hangar deck. Historians still debate whether this was from Best's wingmen scoring a second bomb hit, or from the enormous pile of unstored ordnance cooking off. What no one debates is the result. Dozens of bombs detonated simultaneously. Multiple torpedoes exploded in rapid sequence. The entire midsection of the hangar deck became a fireball so intense that the temperature exceeded 1,000 degrees Celsius almost instantly. To put that in perspective, aluminum melts at 660 degrees. The aircraft on Akagi's hangar deck were made of aluminum. They didn't burn. They melted. Aluminum skin dripped from airframes like the candle wax. Rubber tires liquefied into pools of toxic black sludge that burned with choking smoke. Steel bulkheads glowed cherry red. And the men, the sailors, who had been working frantically to rearm those aircraft just seconds before the ones closest to the blast center, never knew what happened. The heat wave moved faster than human reaction time. They were incinerated where they stood. Those slightly further away were engulfed in a wall of burning aviation gasoline that sprayed outward from ruptured fuel lines like a fire hose from hell. Men became torches, running, screaming, flailing torches stumbling through a hangar deck that had become a furnace. Some threw themselves through openings in the hull and fell into the ocean 60 feet below. Some rolled on the deck trying to extinguish flames that could not be extinguished because the fuel kept flowing. Some simply collapsed where they stood and were consumed. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, the legendary pilot who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor just 6 months earlier, was on the bridge level when the bombs fell. The explosion threw him across the deck, shattering both his legs. When he dragged himself to a vantage point and looked down into the hangar deck, what he saw would haunt him for the rest of his life. A sea of fire. Aircraft exploding one after another like firecrackers. Torpedoes detonating with concussions that shook the entire ship. And men. Burning men everywhere. But Akagi was a warship. She had damage control teams. She had firefighting equipment. She had brave men trained for exactly this kind of catastrophe. And they did not hesitate. Within 3 minutes of the first explosion, Commander Nakajima in the damage control station began organizing the response. He had 120 firefighters at his disposal equipped with hoses, foam suppressant, and CO2 extinguishers. These were not ordinary sailors. They were specialists, men who had trained for years to fight fires at sea, and every single one of them knew that if they failed the ship, and everyone on it would die. The first team advanced into the hangar deck from the bow end. The heat hit them like a physical wall 20 meters before they reached the flames. Paint on the bulkheads spontaneously combusted, not from direct contact with fire. The radiant heat alone was enough to ignite paint. The air was so hot that breathing felt like inhaling broken glass. Each breath scorched their throats and lungs. But they kept going. They opened the water hoses and directed streams into the inferno. The water evaporated on contact. Not slowly, instantly. The moment it touched the superheated deck, it flashed to steam, creating a scalding cloud that burned exposed skin on contact. The steam layer reduced visibility to 0. The firefighters were fighting blind in a furnace, guided only by the sound of explosions and the screams of dying men. A second team entered from the stern, carrying foam suppressant. They sprayed it over burning fuel pools, trying to smother the flames. It worked in small patches, for a few seconds. Then another fuel line would rupture, fresh gasoline would flow over the foam, and the fire would reignite 3 times worse than before. Every time they extinguished one blaze, 3 new ones erupted around them. Then at 10:40 in the morning, just 18 minutes after Best's bomb hit the anti-aircraft ammunition magazine near the hangar deck, cooked off. Thousands of 25mm shells exploded simultaneously. The noise was beyond description. Shell fragments punched through bulkheads in every direction, shooting into adjacent compartments like shrapnel from a giant grenade. Some fragments pierced upward through the flight deck, killing men trying to fight fires topside. Others punched downward into fuel storage areas, rupturing more lines. Burning gasoline began flowing with the ship's list, creating rivers of liquid fire that streamed from midship toward the bow, igniting everything in their path. The firefighters did not retreat. Let that sink in. They did not retreat. Men were dying around them. Explosions were going off every few minutes. The temperature was rising. Their equipment was failing. Water pressure dropped as pipes burst from heat expansion. Hoses went dry. Supplies ran out, and still they fought. Warrant officers led their teams deeper into compartments where the temperature exceeded anything survivable, knowing full well they might not come back. One team was assigned the most critical mission on the ship: flood the main magazines with seawater before they exploded. If the primary ammunition magazines detonated, the explosion would break Akagi's keel, and the ship would sink in minutes, taking everyone still aboard with her. They found the sea valves and opened them. Seawater rushed into the magazines, but the compartments were so hot that the water boiled on contact with the deck, sending up jets of scalding steam that severely burned several men. They kept the valves open. They stood in that steam skin, blistering until the magazines were flooded. They saved the ship from immediate destruction, but they could not save it from the fire. By 11:00 in the morning, Commander Nakajima was forced to deliver the report that Captain Aoki had been dreading. "Sir, the situation is deteriorating. Fire is spreading to new compartments. Casualties are mounting. Some sections are too hot to enter. The automatic firefighting system is 60% destroyed." Captain Taijiro Aoki, commanding officer of Akagi, received this news standing on a bridge that was rapidly filling with smoke. Fire was licking at the base of the island superstructure. Communications were failing. He could barely see the flight deck through the black haze. And he had to make a decision that no captain ever wants to make. But before Aoki could decide anything, a more senior officer had to act first. Admiral Chuchi Nagumo, commander of the entire Kido Butai strike force, was also on Akagi's bridge. And he was paralyzed. This was the man who had commanded the Pearl Harbor attack. The man who had swept the Pacific clean of opposition. The man who had never lost a battle. And now his flagship was burning around him and he could barely function. His chief of staff grabbed his arm. "Admiral, you must transfer your flag. "We cannot command the fleet from here. Communications are failing. You must go." This was not just a practical decision. It was a symbolic one. An admiral leaving his flagship in battle was an admission of defeat, and Nagumo knew it. For a long moment, he stood motionless, staring at the chaos around him. Smoke, fire, the muffled sounds of explosions below, the screams of wounded men. Then he nodded. Around 11:00 in the morning, Admiral Nagumo and his staff were transferred to the destroyer Nawaki by boat. As the small craft pulled away from Akagi's hull, Nagumo turned back. The ship he had commanded through 6 months of unbroken victory was engulfed in smoke and flame from bow to stern. "Forgive me, Akagi," he whispered. "I have failed you." Captain Aoki stayed. "This is my ship," he told his officers. "I will remain until the end." And the end was coming. By noon, temperatures in some compartments had exceeded 70 degrees Celsius. That is 158 degrees Fahrenheit. Human tissue cannot survive prolonged exposure to that temperature. Firefighting water pipes were bursting from the heat. Rescue teams trying to reach trapped sailors found corridors that had become furnaces. Dozens of men died attempting to save their comrades from compartments that had become ovens. By 2:00 in the afternoon, nearly 4 hours since Best's bomb struck, the fires were not just uncontrolled. They were spreading. Flames had reached areas dangerously close to the engine rooms, the last major system still functioning. Captain Aoki called his remaining officers together. The damage report was devastating. Hangar deck completely engulfed. Firefighting capability 60% destroyed. Over 200 dead or critically wounded. Ship's structural integrity compromised by heat and secondary explosions. "Is saving this ship possible?" Aoki asked. The silence that followed lasted an eternity. Finally, Commander Nakajima spoke. "Sir, with our current equipment and manpower, I do not believe so. The fire is too large. We are fighting a battle we cannot win." At 4:30 in the afternoon, a massive explosion larger than any that had come before tore through the ship. Part of the flight deck collapsed downward into the hangar deck. A column of black smoke shot hundreds of meters into the sky. Aoki gave the order. "All crew not essential to keeping the ship afloat. Prepare to abandon ship." The words spread through the burning vessel like a wave of grief. Men wept openly. Abandon Akagi. The ship that had struck Pearl Harbor. The ship that had never been defeated. The ship they had believed was invincible. But orders were orders. Lifeboats were lowered. Destroyers Arashi and Nawaki moved alongside to receive survivors. Groups were evacuated one by one. By 5:00 in the afternoon, most of the crew had been taken off. Captain Aoki made a final inspection, moving through every accessible compartment, ensuring no living soul remained behind. He was the last man to leave, departing around 5:15 after confirming all survivors had been rescued. As his boat pulled away from the burning hull, he turned back one last time. The entire midsection of the ship blazed. Black smoke blotted out half the sky. "Sayonara, Akagi," he whispered. But Akagi was not dead yet. Not quite. And what happened that night in the darkness of the Pacific would become one of the most emotionally devastating moments of the entire war. Because killing an aircraft carrier is one thing, having to order your own ships to deliver the killing blow to your own flagship, that is something else entirely. The order came from Admiral Yamamoto himself, hundreds of kilometers away on the battleship Yamato. 2 words that carried the weight of an empire's broken pride. Scuttle Akagi. 4 destroyers. 4 sets of torpedo tubes. Loaded and aimed at the ship their crews had sworn to protect. Sailors wept as they turned the weapons toward their own carrier. Hands shook as they loaded the torpedoes. No one wanted to pull the trigger, but someone had to. And when those 4 Type 93 torpedoes struck Akagi's hull at 5:00 in the morning on June 5th, they did not just sink a ship. They sank Japanese naval supremacy in the Pacific. Forever. At 5:20 in the morning, Aijin Akagi slipped beneath the waves. Bow first, then the bridge, then the flight deck. Finally, the stern rose high propellers reaching toward the sky one last time before sliding majestically beneath the surface. She came to rest, 400 meters below on the ocean floor, where she would remain undisturbed for 77 years. But here is what most people do not know. Akagi was not alone. On that same morning, Akagi Soryu and Hiryu all met the same fate. 4 carriers sunk in a single day. Over 300 irreplaceable pilots lost. The Kido Butai, the most powerful carrier strike force in history, ceased to exist in 24 hours. And the man who started it all, Richard Best. He landed back on Enterprise that afternoon with his engine sputtering on fumes. He was exhausted. His back ached from the crushing G-forces of his dive. And, unknown to anyone at the time, the faulty oxygen system in his aircraft had been feeding him sodium hydroxide fumes throughout the flight. The caustic chemical was already destroying his lungs. Within months, he would be diagnosed with tuberculosis, aggravated by chemical damage. He would never fly in combat again. The man who sank Akagi gave his lungs to do it. But the full story of what Midway cost, what it changed, and what it meant for every battle that followed, is something most history books get wrong. Because Midway was not just about 4 carriers sinking. It was about what Japan lost that could never be rebuilt. And it was about what one morning of chaos, so courage, and impossible luck did to the trajectory of the entire Pacific War. That story belongs to Part 3. In Part 1, you watched Richard Best dive his SBD Dauntless at 70 degrees toward the flight deck of Japan's most feared carrier. In Part 2, you watched that single bomb turn Akagi into 18 hours of burning hell, watched her crew fight an unwinnable fire, watched 4 Japanese destroyers torpedo their own flagship, and watched the Red Dragon slip beneath the waves at 5:20 in the morning on June 5, 1942. But Akagi did not die alone. Akagi, Soryu, Hiryu, all 4 carriers of the Kido Butai, the most powerful strike force in naval history, were destroyed in a single day. Over 300 aircraft lost. Hundreds of the most experienced naval aviators in the world killed. And the man who started the chain reaction, Lieutenant Richard Best, landed back on Enterprise that afternoon, with damaged lungs that would end his flying career forever. Now, here is the part most people never hear about, because sinking 4 carriers was devastating. But what Japan lost that day went far beyond steel and aluminum, and the full scale of the catastrophe would not become clear for months. When news of Midway reached Tokyo, the Imperial Japanese Navy did something unprecedented. They lied. Not just to the public, not just to the press. They lied to their own government. The details of the defeat were classified at the highest level. Wounded sailors returning to Japan were isolated in hospitals and forbidden from contacting their families. Officers were transferred to remote posts where they could not talk. The official story released to the Japanese public claimed Midway was a victory. 1 American carrier sunk, they announced. Japanese losses minimal. The reality was the exact opposite. Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers. America had lost 1 USS Yorktown, which was torpedoed by a Japanese submarine on June 6th. The exchange rate was catastrophic, 4-1. But the numbers only told part of the story. The real damage was human. Japan's carrier aviation program had been built over more than a decade. The pilots who flew from Akagi, Soryu, and Hiryu were not just trained aviators. They were combat veterans with thousands of hours of flight time. Many had been flying since the war in China in the late 1930s. They could put a torpedo into a moving ship from 2 miles out. They could dogfight in a Zero with a precision that terrified every Allied pilot in the Pacific. These men represented an investment of years of training, hundreds of thousands of flight hours, and irreplaceable institutional knowledge. At Midway, 110 of these elite pilots were killed. That number might not sound enormous compared to the millions who died in World War II. But consider this. Japan's entire pre-war carrier pilot training program graduated approximately 100 pilots per year. And those graduates needed 2 to 3 more years of operational training before they reached the skill level of the men lost at Midway. Japan did not just lose 110 pilots. They lost a decade of training that could not be compressed, accelerated, or replaced no matter how much money or resources were thrown at the problem. The Americans, by contrast, had an industrial approach to pilot training. The United States was already producing thousands of new naval aviators per year through programs that would eventually graduate over 60,000 pilots during the war. The quality gap would take time to close, but the quantity gap was already enormous and growing wider by the month. Admiral Yamamoto understood this immediately. When the full reports from Midway reached him aboard the battleship Yamato, he reportedly sat in stunned silence for several minutes. His chief of staff later wrote that Yamamoto aged 10 years in a single night. The grand strategist who had planned Pearl Harbor, who had warned his government that he could run wild for 6 months but could not guarantee victory after that, now saw his own prophecy coming true with terrible precision. Exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the initiative had been ripped from Japan's hands. But here is what made the situation even more dire. Japan could not simply build new carriers and train new pilots to replace what was lost. The industrial math did not work. Japan's total steel production in 1942 was approximately 7 million tons. America's was over 80 million tons. Japan could build perhaps 2 to 3 fleet carriers per year. America was already laying the keels for 17 new Essex-class carriers, each one larger and more capable than anything Japan could produce. The shipyards in Newport News, Philadelphia, Brooklyn, and Quincy were running 3 shifts, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The war of attrition that Yamamoto had desperately tried to avoid by destroying the American fleet in one decisive battle was now inevitable. And it was a war Japan could not win. But this was not just about numbers and production statistics. The psychological impact of Midway rippled through both navies in ways that changed how every subsequent battle was fought. On the Japanese side, the loss of the 4 carriers created a crisis of confidence that bordered on institutional trauma. Before Midway, Japanese naval officers had operated with an almost spiritual certainty in their own superiority. Their ships were faster, their pilots were better, their torpedoes were deadlier. Their tactics were more aggressive. This was not just arrogance. It was backed by 6 months of unbroken victory across millions of square miles of ocean. They had crushed the Americans at Pearl Harbor. They had sunk the British battleship Prince of Wales and the battle cruiser Repulse. They had swept the Dutch and Australian navies aside like debris. After Midway, that certainty was gone. Japanese commanders became cautious where they had once been bold. They second-guessed decisions that would have been made instantly before June 4th. The aggressive, offensive-minded spirit that had characterized the Kido Butai was replaced by a defensive mentality that would persist for the rest of the war. And, on the American side, something equally powerful happened: confidence. For 6 months, the United States Navy had been reeling. Pearl Harbor had been a humiliation. The fall of the Philippines had been a disaster. Wake Island, Guam, the Java Sea. Everywhere the Americans fought, they lost. Morale was fragile. The public was scared. There were genuine fears that Japan might attack the west coast of the United States. Midway changed everything. Not overnight, and not completely. But the knowledge that the Japanese could be beaten, that their carriers could be sunk, that their seemingly invincible fleet could be caught and destroyed, transformed American naval thinking. Officers who had been cautious became aggressive. Pilots who had been intimidated by the Zero's reputation discovered that with proper tactics, the Japanese could be outfought. The entire psychological dynamic of the Pacific War shifted on June 4th, 1942. The first concrete test of this new dynamic came just 2 months later. August 7th, 1942. Guadalcanal. The United States Marines landed on this jungle-covered island in the Solomon Islands chain, in what would become the first major Allied offensive in the Pacific. Guadalcanal was strategically vital. The Japanese were building an airfield there that, if completed, would allow them to threaten the supply lines between the United States and Australia. The airfield had to be captured. The Marines hit the beaches at dawn. 11,000 men stormed ashore against light initial resistance and captured the partially completed airfield within 2 days. They renamed it Henderson Field after a Marine pilot killed at Midway. But taking the airfield was the easy part. Holding it would become one of the most brutal campaigns of the entire war. The Japanese response was immediate and furious. On the night of August 8th, just one day after the landings, a Japanese cruiser force under Vice Admiral Kunichi Mikawa raced down the channel between the Solomon Islands, a waterway that would soon earn the name Iron Bottom Sound for all the ships that would sink there. In the Battle of Savo Island, Mikawa's cruisers caught the Allied screening force completely by surprise. In 32 minutes of close range night fighting, the Japanese sank 4 Allied heavy cruisers and damaged a 5th. Over 1,000 Allied sailors were killed. It was one of the worst naval defeats in American history. But the Marines on Guadalcanal held. They held because Henderson Field was operational. They held because American pilots flew from that airfield day after day, attacking Japanese ships and troop transports trying to reinforce the island. They held because the lesson of Midway that air power controlled the Pacific had been learned in blood and fire. For 6 months, from August 1942 to February 1943, the battle raged. 7 major naval engagements were fought in the waters around Guadalcanal. Both sides lost dozens of ships. The Japanese sent convoy after convoy of reinforcements, running destroyers down the slot at night, in what the Americans called the Tokyo Express. The Marines and later Army troops fought in tropical heat, torrential rain, malaria-infested jungle, and near-constant bombardment. The Japanese committed approximately 36,000 troops to retake Guadalcanal. They lost over 20,000 of them. About 9,000 were killed in combat. The rest died of disease, starvation, and wounds. American forces suffered approximately 7,100 casualties, including 1,600 killed. But the critical difference was sustainability. America could replace its losses. Japan could not. Every ship sunk, every aircraft destroyed, every pilot killed around Guadalcanal was a loss that Japan's industrial base could not replenish at the rate required. The Americans lost the carrier USS Wasp to a submarine torpedo in September. They had another carrier ready within months. The Japanese lost the light carrier Ryuyo in the Battle of the Eastern Solomons in August. Replacing her would take years they did not have. By February 1943, the Japanese made the decision to evacuate Guadalcanal. It was the first time in the Pacific War that Japan abandoned territory it had captured. The retreat was skillfully executed with destroyers evacuating approximately 10,600 surviving troops over 3 nights. But the strategic implications were enormous. Japan was now on the defensive. The tide that had turned at Midway was now flowing inexorably against them. The impact spread across the entire Pacific theater. After Guadalcanal, American forces began the Long Island hopping campaign that would carry them across thousands of miles of ocean toward Japan itself. Each battle applied the lessons learned at Midway and Guadalcanal. Control the air. Protect your carriers. Strike first and strike hard. Use intelligence to anticipate enemy movements. Never give the enemy time to recover. In November 1943, the new Essex-class carriers began arriving in the Pacific. These were the ships whose keels had been laid in the frantic months after Pearl Harbor. Each one displaced 27,000 tons and carried over 90 aircraft. By early 1944, the United States had 15 fleet and light carriers in the Pacific, compared to Japan's 9. By mid-1944, the ratio was even more lopsided. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, in June 1944, exactly 2 years after Midway, demonstrated how completely the balance of power had shifted. The Japanese launched 373 carrier aircraft against the American fleet. American fighters and anti-aircraft guns shot down 315 of them in a single day. American pilots called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japan lost 3 more carriers in the battle, including the fleet carrier Taiho, the newest and most advanced carrier in the Japanese Navy, which was sunk by a single torpedo from the American submarine Albacore. The numbers tell the full story. At Pearl Harbor in December 1941, Japan had 10 aircraft carriers in the Pacific. By the end of 1944, they had effectively none. The United States, which had started the war with 7 carriers in the Pacific, now had nearly 100 of all types. The industrial avalanche that Yamamoto had feared and tried to prevent by striking Pearl Harbor had buried Japan exactly as he predicted. And the man who dropped the bomb that started it, Lieutenant Richard Best. By the time the Essex carriers were sweeping the Japanese from the Pacific, he was lying in a hospital bed in San Diego, his lungs scarred, and damaged his flying career over at the age of 32. The faulty oxygen system in his SBD Dauntless had fed him caustic sodium hydroxide fumes during his dive on Akagi. The chemical damage combined with the physical strain of combat flying triggered tuberculosis that would plague him for years. Best was awarded the Navy Cross and the Distinguished Flying Cross. 2 medals for sinking an aircraft carrier with a single bomb, for arguably firing the single most consequential shot of the entire Pacific War. Then, the Navy quietly retired him and moved on. The war machine had no use for a grounded pilot, no matter what he had done. The greatest dive bomber pilot in American naval history spent the rest of World War II watching from the sidelines, as the victory he helped make possible unfolded without him. But there is one final chapter to the story that almost nobody knows. A chapter about what happened to Richard Best after the war. About what happened to the wreck of Akagi, lying 400 meters below the Pacific. About the Japanese sailors who survived that terrible day and carried their memories for decades in silence. And about a discovery in October 2019 that brought the Red Dragon back from the darkness after 77 years. That story, the last chapter, belongs to part 4. From a factory worker's son in Bayonne, New Jersey, to the cockpit of an SBD Dauntless dive bomber plunging at 70 degrees toward the most feared aircraft carrier in the Pacific Ocean. From 1,000-pound bomb falling for 60 seconds to an 18-hour inferno that consumed 267 lives. From the death of 4 carriers in a single morning to the collapse of Japanese naval supremacy across the entire Pacific. You have followed this story through 3 parts. Through the dive, through the fire, through the battles that followed. But there is one question we have not answered. What happened to the man who dropped that bomb? What happened to Lieutenant Richard Halsey? Best after the war machine was done with him, because this story has a final twist that nobody expected. And it begins with a cough. When Best landed back on Enterprise on the afternoon of June 4th, 1942, he was already sick. He did not know it yet. The adrenaline of combat, the exhaustion of the mission, the overwhelming chaos of the day masked the symptoms. But something was wrong inside his chest. During his dive on Akagi, the oxygen system in his SBD Dauntless had malfunctioned. Instead of feeding him pure oxygen through his mask at high altitude, the defective system had been mixing in sodium hydroxide fumes, a caustic industrial chemical, used as a CO2 absorbent in the breathing apparatus. With every breath Best took during his dive, he was inhaling a substance that was quietly destroying the lining of his lungs. Within days of the battle, Best developed a persistent cough. Within weeks, the cough became severe. Navy doctors examined him and discovered what the sodium hydroxide had done. The chemical burns to his lung tissue had created the perfect conditions for tuberculosis to take hold. By September 1942, just 3 months after his historic dive, Best was diagnosed with active TB. He was immediately grounded.
Combat mission
Again, think about that for a moment. The man who arguably fired the single most important shot of the Pacific War. The man who sank an aircraft carrier with 1 bomb and helped turn the tide of the entire conflict was finished as a combat pilot at 32 years old. Not because of enemy fire. Not because of a crash. Because of a defective rubber gasket in his own aircraft's oxygen system. Best spent the next several years in and out of hospitals and sanitariums fighting the tuberculosis that the sodium hydroxide had triggered. The treatment in the 1940s was brutal. Bed rest for months on end. Collapse therapy, where doctors deliberately deflated a diseased lung to let it heal. No antibiotics effective against TB would become widely available until streptomycin in the late 1940s. Best endured it all with the same quiet discipline he had brought to dive bombing.
He did not complain. He did not seek attention. He simply fought a different kind of battle, one measured in months and years instead of seconds and minutes. The Navy awarded Best the Navy Cross and the Distinguished Flying Cross for his actions at Midway. 2 medals for sinking an aircraft carrier and helping to change the course of a world war. Then, they medically retired him in 1944 and essentially moved on. The war effort needed pilots who could fly, not heroes who could not. Best accepted this without bitterness, at least publicly. He took a civilian job with the Rand Corporation, a military think tank in Santa Monica, California, where he worked quietly for decades in security and logistics. The man who had performed one of the most spectacular feats of aerial combat in history spent the rest of his working life behind a desk. Best rarely spoke about Midway. When asked, he would deflect with characteristic modesty. He would talk about his squadron mates, about McCluskey's leadership, about the torpedo bomber pilots who had sacrificed themselves to pull the Zeros down to sea level. He almost never talked about his own dive. In interviews years later, he described the attack on Akagi in flat technical terms, as if he were describing a routine training exercise, rather than the moment that broke the back of Japanese naval power. I dove. I released. I pulled out. That is what we were trained to do. No drama, no chest beating. Just a man who did his job and paid a price that nobody ever fully acknowledged. But the legacy of what Best and those 5 dive bombers did at Midway extends far beyond one man's personal sacrifice. It reshaped military thinking for the next 80 years and counting. The Battle of Midway proved beyond any possible doubt that aircraft carriers had replaced battleships as the dominant weapon of naval warfare. Before Midway, there were still admirals on both sides who believed that the big gun battleship was the queen of the seas. Yamamoto himself had built his Midway plan around a massive battleship force that was supposed to deliver the killing blow after the carriers had softened up the American fleet. Those battleships, including the 72,000-ton super battleship, Yamato, the largest warship ever built, sailed hundreds of miles behind the carrier force and never fired a shot. They were irrelevant. The battle was decided entirely by aircraft launched from carrier decks. After Midway, every major navy in the world reoriented around carrier aviation. The United States built 151 aircraft carriers of all types during World War II. By the war's end, the U.S. Navy was operating nearly 100 carriers in the Pacific alone. The Essex-class carriers that began arriving in late 1943 were the direct descendants of the lessons learned at Midway. Armored flight decks, better damage control, improved firefighting systems, redundant communications. Every weakness that had been exposed on Akagi Kagasoryu and Hiryu was studied, analyzed, and engineered out of the next generation of American carriers. That evolution never stopped. The Forrestal-class supercarriers of the 1950s, the nuclear-powered Enterprise in 1961, the Nimitz-class carriers that served from the 1970s through the 2000s. Today's Gerald R. Ford-class carriers, displacing over 100,000 tons and carrying over 75 aircraft, are the great-grandchildren of the lessons written in fire and blood at Midway. Every one of them incorporates damage control principles that were developed because of what happened to Akagi. Every one of them carries firefighting systems designed to prevent the kind of chain reaction that turned a single bomb hit into an uncontrollable inferno. The dive bombing tactics that Best employed also evolved into something far more lethal. The concept of precision strike from altitude, putting one bomb on one target with accuracy, became the foundation of modern precision-guided munitions. The laser-guided bombs of Vietnam, the GPS-guided JDAMs of the Gulf War and Afghanistan, the precision cruise missiles of today. They all trace their conceptual lineage back to the same idea that Richard Best practiced obsessively with his squadron: one pass, one weapon, do not miss. 11 nations today operate aircraft carriers. The United States maintains 11 nuclear-powered supercarriers, each one capable of projecting more combat power than most countries' entire air forces. China is rapidly building a carrier fleet of its own. The strategic principles that govern how these ships are used, how they are protected, how their air wings are deployed, all of it flows from the lessons of June 4th, 1942. But the deepest lesson of Midway is not about technology or tactics. It is about the nature of decisive moments in history and how unpredictable they truly are. Consider the chain of events that led to Akagi's destruction. American codebreakers had to break JN-25. Nimitz had to trust Rochefort's analysis when Washington disagreed. 3 carriers had to be positioned at exactly the right place at exactly the right time. 41 torpedo bomber crews had to sacrifice themselves in attacks that seemed completely futile, but were actually pulling the Zero fighters down to low altitude. McCluskey had to spot the destroyer Arashi at the exact moment he was about to turn back. And then, Richard Best, in a split-second decision, when his squadron leader accidentally targeted the wrong carrier, had to pull his 3-plane section away and aim for Akagi instead. Remove any single link from that chain, and the bomb does not fall. Akagi survives. Perhaps Midway ends differently. Perhaps the war lasts longer. Perhaps thousands more die. The margin between the world we live in and a very different one was measured in seconds and inches, and the decisions of individual human beings under unimaginable pressure. That is what makes this story worth telling. Not the explosions, not the statistics, not the ships, the people. The codebreaker who worked in his bathrobe for 20 hours a day. The torpedo bomber pilots who flew into certain death knowing their sacrifice might mean something. The firefighters who walked into a 1,000-degree inferno because their shipmates were trapped inside. The captain who stayed on his burning ship until every living soul was off. And a quiet, meticulous pilot from New Jersey who believed you get one chance so you do not miss. And now the detail that almost nobody knows. Richard Best lived. He beat the tuberculosis. He survived the sodium hydroxide damage. He worked at RAND for decades, raised a family in Southern California, and lived a quiet life far from the ocean where he had changed history. He rarely attended reunions. He did not write a memoir. He did not seek fame. The man who sank Akagi simply went on living in the way that the best of that generation often did without fanfare, without complaint, carrying the weight of what they had seen and done in private silence. Best died on October 28, 2001, at the age of 91. He had outlived Akagi by 59 years. He had outlived the empire that Akagi served. He had outlived nearly every other pilot who flew at Midway. And, in his final years, he finally began to receive some of the recognition he deserved. Historians sought him out. Documentarians interviewed him. The Navy acknowledged that his single bomb on Akagi was one of the most consequential acts of the entire Pacific War. Then, in October 2019, 18 years after Best's death, and 77 years after the battle, the research vessel Petrel, funded by the estate of Microsoft co-founder Paul Allen, located Akagi's wreck on the floor of the Pacific Ocean. She was found resting upside down at a depth of 400 meters, more than 3 miles below the surface, in the eternal darkness of the abyssal plain. Sonar images showed her hull largely intact, a ghost ship frozen in time, still bearing the scars of the fire that burned for 18 hours and the torpedo hits that sent her to the bottom. The discovery brought closure to a story that had been waiting 77 years for its final chapter. The Red Dragon had been found, and somewhere in the twisted steel of her hangar deck, in the place where Best's bomb detonated and started the chain reaction that sank an empire, the evidence of that moment still exists. Frozen, silent. Preserved in the cold and the dark and the crushing pressure of the deep Pacific. From a factory worker's son with a 1,000-pound bomb and a philosophy of do not miss, to the destruction of Japan's most powerful aircraft carrier, in 6 seconds to the turning of the entire Pacific War. Richard Best proved that history does not always turn on the decisions of generals and admirals. Sometimes it turns on one man, one plane, one bomb, and one moment of absolute precision when everything else has failed. 267 men died aboard Akagi. 4 carriers were lost in a single day. The war in the Pacific was shortened by years. Countless thousands of lives were saved by the victory at Midway. And the man who started it all came home, went to work, raised his family, and never asked for anything in return. That is the story of 10:22 a.m. on June 4th, 1942. The morning that 5 bombers killed the Red Dragon and changed the world. If you know another story like this, a forgotten moment that turned the tide of history, share it in the comments. Because World War II is full of stories like Richard Best's. Stories of ordinary people who did extraordinary things when the world needed them most. Subscribe so you do not miss the next one. And remember what Best told his pilots before every mission. You get one pass, one dive, one bomb. Make it count. He did.